purpose of this video is to explain how the English state is suppressing Scotland's indigenous languages as part of its ongoing colonial control of Scotland. There are three languages in use today in Scotland. One is Scots. This is an example of a sentence in Scots. Another is English. Here is the English translation of the Scots sentence. The third is Scottish Gaelic. This is a translation of the English sentence above. Scotland's colonial master, England, has been working to eradicate our two local languages and replace it with English since 1872, although the idea to do this formally actually started in 1867 at a meeting of the Privy Council in Westminster. This is a menu of the topics I'll cover within this video. It starts by giving you a quick historical overview where the Scots and Gaelic languages originated, followed by an explanation that language and culture are one of the same thing. I then briefly summarise an earlier video that shows that Scotland is indeed a colony of England. Once this is done, I explain how England has and is suppressing our language as a deliberate colonial act. Finally, an update of how social and economic changes since the Second World War has aided the suppression of our indigenous languages. This ends with a brief political situation since the creation of the Scottish Parliament in 1999. There are several societies and organisations that try to protect Gaelic and Scots. Here are two of them. We now begin a section about the source of Scotland's indigenous languages. It is believed that the Gaelic language began in Turkey 4,000 years ago. It changed with time and moved west across the European continent. This map, set about 600 BC, highlights one area including the British Isles and what is today France. The historians call this area of the Brythonic language variant of Gaelic. As you can see, it covers all the mainland of the British Isles, so these islands have a common language ancestry. Note that Ireland does not have the same past. Its language root is similar to Portugal. Now moving forward 1,000 years. The Scottish tribe from Ireland started to have settlements on Kintyre around 100 AD and in time spread north and east. The actual move east was probably much farther than I indicate here. They spoke an early version of Irish Gaelic. The Britons came from what is now southern England after 400 and before 500 AD to escape the mass immigration that was occurring of Angles and Saxons from Germany into southeastern England. This happened after Rome's legions departed in 410 AD. These Britons migrated to Cornwall, Scotland and Brittany in France. At that time the Breton, Cornish and Scots Britons would have had an identical language. The Scots Britons built an empire on the Clyde estuary and the Clyde River Valley. It was centred on a rock we call today Dunbarton. They spoke a variant of the Brythonic language. The southern border areas of what is now Scotland was peopled by an area that historians called Cymric. These spoke the language variant which covered the whole north of England at the time. In fact, the Romans called this area the Brigantes tribe region. The Picts also spoke a variant of the Brythonic language. Due to geography, this was probably different from the Britons and the Cymric group, purely because of the fact that at that time the land and water levels were such that the Forth and Clyde nearly cut Scotland in half. The Jutes, a tribe from Denmark and a small part of northern Germany, started settling in this area in 500 AD, eventually moving down to the Humber and across to Cumbria, and created an area and a kingdom called Northumbria. So here we have an area we now call Scotland, with three main language groups: the Scotti with early Gaelic, the Jutes with a Danish Germanic language, and three groups with different variants of the once common Brythonic language. The boundaries of language communities would not have been as black and white as the lines on this map indicate. The boundary areas overlap, as they do in all border areas today. Moving forward 500 years. Between 750 and 845, when the country of Alaba came into existence, the Pictish and Scotti areas merged linguistically and politically. It was a Scotti king called in English Kenneth MacAlpine that was the first joint leader of the Pict and Scottish areas. Once the leadership started talking Gaelic, then in time the community followed. In time also, due to the separation by water from Ireland, a variant of Irish Gaelic formed Scots Gaelic. Even today, the difference between the Irish and Scots Gaelic is 25%. At this time, there were still in the Clyde area many Breton speakers. They were known as the Brets by the Picts at that time. In fact, we know that the last speaker of the language died in the 1600s on a farm called Altreve in the border areas of Scotland. The Scots language started as a mixture of Briton, Jute, Cymric, and probably Pict. It was probably a larger area than shown here. Once again, clear boundaries are not known, but it probably went up towards the northeast coast. The Vikings started entering these areas in the 600s and stayed up to the 1150s. They intermarried with the local communities. They had a variant of Gaelic, Scots, and three Norse languages, all intermingled together. Moving to 1700. In time, the language of the north became known as Norn, N-O-R-N, and was last used by some people as late as the 1860s in Shetland. Indeed, the Scots Doric variant in the northeast of Scotland includes some Norn words within its language and dialect. Scots Gaelic was being pushed back by Scots speakers by this time. Indeed, by 1700, Scots would have been spoken in all the main population centres around the northeast coast towards Inverness. Scots Gaelic by now still had communities in the southwest of Scotland. Scots was the language of the state and had been for some time. Due to trade, a few early English words began to enter Scots. Scots and Gaelic were taught in schools, dependent on the location, by the church. This happened after the Reformation in the 1600s. I emphasise that Scots and Gaelic would have been a dual language for many business people at the time. Here are a few examples on the roots of Scots words used today. In my life I have used all of these. I have not included examples of Gaelic here, as that language has changed little over the last 2 centuries, although in the last 40 and 50 years many English words have been added, particularly those relating to technology. I am now moving on to the next topic on the agenda, which is to explain the links between language and culture. There are four main relationship definitions between culture and language. This may seem obvious as we live in a culture that we create as a unique language group. Our history also sets our culture. Note the personal identity statement. Anglophobes in Scotland today do not have this cultural identity to our language or culture, nor do immigrants, obviously. I'm sure many of you that are Scots and Gaelic in Scotland have a different worldview than the southern and middle English neighbours. We see it all the time. This is an important statement. This is why the English colonisers started many years ago to eradicate our Gaelic and Scots languages, because in time you remove culture. Our Scots Anglophobes prove this, and it is working today. In addition, Scots use the Scots language more and less, not more and more, sorry. More on this later. This is known as the culture wheel. It indicates that all are linked for a given group. Language is the glue that holds us together, as is the teaching and understanding of our history. Scottish history has not been taught in Scottish schools, and has not been for over 130 years. We now get the British Empire and how great the UK is, quote England. These two text blocks from the previous slide, think how they affect this culture ring. Moving on again down the agenda, I am going to talk about the colonisation of Scotland in 2 slides. So far you have heard a little about the history of language in Scotland and its links to culture. This section briefly explains English colonisation of Scotland, so that when I later discuss language suppression, you have an understanding where it fits in. This is what colonisation is, the steps a coloniser takes. This is the current situation in the UK today. If you wish to know more about the colonisation process of Scotland, please watch this video. If you load YouTube and in the search icon, just simply type in Scotland, England's colony, and you'll find it. On one slide, here is a summary of the colonial subjugation of Scotland. Due to trade blockades, restrictions, and also the managed financial crisis in Scotland, called the Darien Colony, with the help of Scottish traitors in high positions in society who worked with London to create a one-sided farce called the Treaty of Union in 1707. Between the treaty and 1746, all wealth was taken from Scotland, arsenals were emptied, our 2 royal palaces were allowed to decline. There was no central government, there was no countrywide administration. This meant financial chaos in the boroughs, trade was damaged, and hunger and poverty continued. There was also high levels of anger. Following the Jacobite rebellion of 1745-46, there followed a period of extreme violence against the people in the Highlands that lasted 4 years. Over the next 10 years, there was a building of 430 forts and containment areas. There was new military roads to ensure control. This was a military takeover of Scotland that did not end until 1810. So much for a voluntary union. Between 1748 and 1935, Scots were forced out of Scotland by destitution, the clearances, poor wages. In 1700, it is thought that Scots were about 20% of the population of the British mainland. It is 8.6% today. During the 1800s, 4 million Scots were forced off the country to be replaced by 2 million English people. From 1867 to today, there has been a policy to eradicate Scots and Gaelic. This is the main step in colonisation, to destroy the culture and heritage of a people. 1999 to today, the setting up of the Scottish Parliament, which has restricted powers and no financial control. Power and finance remains at Westminster. This is a colonial administration based on English law, the English Bill of Rights, and does not have Scots law or the Scots Constitution within it. The rest of this talk refers to this topic here, the subjugation of language. It is well understood that every coloniser imposes their own language into a new colony to aid administration and also to impose their culture at the detriment of the colony's language and culture. In 1866 in England, Wales and Scotland, an assessment was made on the ability in the population to read, write and count. It was found that 14% on average had no schooling, mainly due to poverty. Scotland since the Reformation in the 17th century had taught Gaelic and Scots in all its parishes and was administered by the Church of Scotland. The primary focus of this change was an attack on Gaelic and also to focus on reading, writing and arithmetic, with the teaching of history to change to the Empire in England to come soon after. This plan of the Privy Council came law in 1872. The Scotland Office was created from the 1872 Act, and its purpose was to manage and implement the change in Scotland's education to that copy in England. The Church lost control. In 1911, the Education Department for Scotland moved from London to Edinburgh. Looking into how they created the change specified in the 1872 Act, I found lots of information. However, 2 paragraphs explain it all. Remember that schools already existed in all parts of Scotland. Under the Act, approximately 1,000 regional school boards were established quickly, unlike in England where they merely attempted to fill gaps in provision. But in Scotland, they took over all the schools immediately and they removed the control from the church. And they were able to begin to enforce attendance, rather than the decade necessary in England. Some ragged and industrial schools asked to be taken into these boards, while others continued as Sunday schools. All children aged 5 to 13 had to attend, and poverty was not an excuse. The Education Scotland Act effectively put an end to non-English medium education and repressed Scottish Gaelic medium education, with pupils being punished for speaking the language. Pupils were physically punished if caught speaking in Gaelic and beaten again if they did not reveal the names of other students speaking Gaelic. The effect of the Education Act upon Gaelic's language has been described as disastrous, and benign the value of Gaelic culture and language contributed to destroying the self-respect of Gaelic communities. It was a continuation of a general policy from 1707 to Anglicise Scotland. Obviously, by putting an end to non-English medium education, this included Scots. So Scots children were going to school and they were being taught a different enunciation, a different grammar, new words, old words disappeared. It was like learning a new language and moving to a new country. I know that this took place, but I cannot find written proof. I know this because I have talked to 3 people unknown to each other, born on Lewis, who were at primary school at the time, and therefore went through this change. It was traumatic and delayed their advancement for over a year. This memory is from people I know who lived in the Inverness area during this period. Over the years, many people I have met have told me tales of punishment related to speaking Scots. Scots speakers were looked down upon by some in society. Indeed, that continues. In December 2024, in 2 different newspapers, there was an article about students at 2 of Scotland's universities being picked on for speaking Scots. These photographs are of the belt used to punish children in Scotland. It was known as the tawse. In my own experience, it was usually a long wooden ruler that was used on the back of your knuckles. The tawse was banned in Scottish schools in 1987, just over 35 years ago. This data is from the 2022 Scottish Census and shows the stated use of Gaelic and Scots at that time based on the opinions of the people that completed the survey. If you look at both, you will see many have understanding of the words but do not speak it themselves. These are the areas with a low percentage. So here in yellow, very low count of language skills, people are saying that they have a knowledge of a few words or a few phrases in Gaelic. But the real Gaelic speaking areas are the Outer Hebrides with higher levels inside the Inner Hebrides. And in Scots, it's the rural areas here and here that still have the Scots speakers. But unlike here where you see lots of yellow, you can see lots of browns. This signifies that people know the Scots words, and perhaps when they were younger like me, would be speaking it. But their jobs in society forced them to speak and read and write in English. So the knowledge is there, but it's not spoken. In both cases, you can see an increase of those that have this understanding, but it is Gaelic only where the full use of the language has grown. This is a summary of the census results. So this is Scots, and these are the age groups. You can see here, people like myself and the people that actually speak Scots, you can see that in 30 years' time, the language will be dead, and this will diminish. Although the support for Gaelic by the Scottish Government has been going for a few years now, there's not a lot of money spent on it, but even so, you can see the higher levels within the young. As you you can see, Gaelic has increased in all areas, as did Scots. But the census also shows that the number of people using Scots in everyday conversation is declining. This is why Gaelic is starting to recover. This was further enhanced legally in 2016. Even the BBC got involved. Indeed, there are new Gaelic schools starting to be built. The decline in Scots has been caused by the fact it has not been taught in our schools for over a century and is not now used in business. Its decline has also been aided by the changes within society since the Second World War. Once there were tight-knit communities where everyone spoke the language, so it stayed strong. Today Scots is suffering not only from total apathy from the state, but also by our world changing socially. During the Industrial Revolution, slums existed in most large towns. These kept a sense of community, kept the language alive, despite the poor conditions. After the war, about 40% of people lived on the land. Now that is less than 2%. Work in the land. Country communities have spread, young people have moved away, new people have moved in, the language declines. In 1947, there were 92 deep coal mines in Scotland. The last closed in 2002. These communities were economically destroyed very quickly, and although slow, the language is deteriorating in these areas and these communities as well. The textile industry in Scotland was strong in the Scottish borders, West Fife, Paisley, and a few other areas. These industries are also gone. Likewise, the fishing industry in Scotland is greatly diminished from its heyday. No longer do we have busy ports. Even historically very busy ports like Peterhead are now a former shadow of themselves. Steel and shipbuilding died by the year 2000 due to long periods of poor management, lack of investment, and for steel particularly, government policy from 1980. All this means a decline in Scots communities and close-knitness between people that is affected the language really badly. The 2022 census data for the English language, the forcibly imposed language of the coloniser. What does the future hold for language? Gaelic will continue to slowly improve due to its state support. As time passes and more people speak the language, it may one day be heard spoken more often in our streets. The future of Scots is grim. Within 30 years, most of the people that speak it and understand it will be dead. There is no way to learn the language unless you as an individual make the effort. The Scots language societies and dictionaries that exist will not save the language. The colonial administration at Holyrood did, as you heard earlier, help Gaelic. In 2012, our then First Minister was in Canada giving a talk. One of the audience questioned her why Scots was not protected and had its status changed similar to Gaelic. Her glib answer, possibly believed, was that the civil service said it would be too complicated. Really? This is an excuse. Yes, it would take an effort, but had it been done, our young people would have learned it. There would have been a BBC Scots channel, Scots text in newspapers, etc. It is not in the interest of the UK government to do this. They want Scotland assimilated as a Northern English, with a destroyed culture to back up the myth of a voluntary union. Could an independent future by Scotland help Scots? Who knows? It would depend on the current Anglophone elites that run Scotland, settling down after leaving the gravy train called Westminster, and if they try to understand the land they live in. Do you think that'll happen? No. So our constitution and culture and doing something about it will not happen. It is not hard to do as a medium-term project, as it's happening now slowly with Gaelic, but I believe if we allow the elites that run our country currently and run our structures currently, this would not happen. There is one growing independence group that not only wants independence, but will continue to function after Scotland gets its independence, to fight to ensure that our ancient constitution is adhered to with the people sovereign controlling politicians, removal of the English Bill of Rights. Possibly we'll end up with a system like Switzerland, where the people run the government. My personal view, and not necessarily that of Salvo, is that we must positively discriminate in all areas that run the country: civil service, courts, universities, education, military. We must ensure that all the top positions are filled by Scots and not foreigners, and we do this by positive discrimination during recruitment. Only by doing this can we break from what we have now. We could and will, I'm sure, set up to take the culture, have Scots and Gaelic teaching in schools as well as English, and to remove as much as possible in time part of our imposed English culture, although obviously lots and lots of that will stay because we've been linked together politically for a long time. A final word in Scots. This is the language of the coloniser. This is the same in Scots Gaelic, a proud language that's been going for several thousand years. This is the end of my talk. I hope you have found it interesting. The YouTube videos here highlighted in pink are complete, with 2 more to be created in this history series. I hope that you find them educational, even if you personally disagree with specific slides. Thank you very much for taking the time to watch and listen to this video. It's much appreciated. Goodbye.